I think practice is even more important in learning. People who are just doing practice without any education will probably get further along than people who do just learning and no practice.
Welcome back to the Management Theory Toolbox, your top destination for the behind the scenes of the management and business world. This isn't your typical business podcast. Yes, there are plenty of resources out there that will give you specific tips and tricks to manage your employees or create a strategic plan. But here, we believe that management is too complex to be summarized in a few tips and tricks. At the Management Theory Toolbox, our mission is always to go a layer deeper, uncovering theories and tools that will help you manage your unique situations, making you more effective than trying to follow some cookie-cutter behaviors. So far on the Management Theory Toolbox, we've been on a journey learning about, learning in an organizational context, of course. We've talked about how the agility and competitive advantage of an organization are inseparable from the learning and development of employees in episodes 9 and 10. We've also covered multiple aspects of psychology, especially focused on operant conditioning. And in our last episode, we talked with neuroscientist Dr. Sara De Felice about how social environments, like in an organization, can affect the learning process, giving us some ideas for how managers and leaders can better design the learning environments. But there are 4 additional conditions for learning that we haven't yet discussed in depth. First, people need to know why they're learning what they're learning. A growing body of research has discovered, not surprisingly, that people are motivated to learn when they understand why what they're learning is important, something that was emphasized by Robert Lopez in episode 7. Not only that, but employees learn best when they use their own experiences as the basis for learning. That is, when they can tie their past experiences to the new knowledge. Furthermore, people need to practice what they've learned. If you don't practice something, you tend to forget it. And lastly, a vast body of research has found that feedback is critical to the learning process. So, 4 additional things that improve, facilitate, or are perhaps even required for efficient and effective learning to occur. People need to know the why, use their own experiences as a basis for learning, practice, and get feedback. So let's imagine a world where all these elements coalesce, shall we? A world where the L&D department ticks every box. From their windowless office, they churn out training session after training session. You sit down at your computer for the latest required corporate training, coffee in hand, mustering up the last ounce of motivation to hit the play button. You're greeted with a monotone lecture about a topic you may or may not ever use again. Even if I need this someday, I'm not exactly bookmarking this for a refresher, you muse, reveling in the quiet sense of rebellion. Let's face it, after starting the lecture video, you probably minimize the window, letting it drone on in the background while you try to get started with your day. Then comes the surprise quiz, a nod to the idea that practice is key. You sigh as you read the first question, realizing you missed that obscure detail the lecture barely even mentioned. This is a world where L&D has really risen to the occasion. Not. We all know that effective learning doesn't come from one-size-fits-all training videos and impersonal quizzes. So what does? That's where employee-generated learning, or EGL, comes into play, by empowering employees to shape their own learning experiences. Not a sterile top-down delivery, but one that is driven by real-world experience and genuine engagement. And today, we're fortunate enough to have with us Kasper Spiro, co-founder and chief learning strategist of EasyGenerator, a company which specializes in employee-generated learning solutions. Hi, Kasper, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Before we get started, go ahead and tell us a bit about your background and your work.
I'm Kasper Spiro. I'm the Chief Learning Strategist at EasyGenerator. I started out as a teacher, but working in the world of learning and learning technology for a long time. Working with EasyGenerator now for 13 years. The first 11 of that, I was the CEO. Now I have a free format role where I'm responsible for the mission, vision, and direction of the company. I recently published a book, Employee-Generated Learning, How to Develop Training That Drive Performance. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I'm really happy to be here on your show today.
Excellent, and thank you for joining us. In recent episodes, we've talked about learning through consequences or operant conditioning, as well as observing others, like social cognitive theory. But more recent research has noted some additional conditions which help facilitate adult learning. And I think your new book and your employee-generated learning model is dialed into those conditions. Before we dive into those, could you explain the employee-generated learning model and how does it fundamentally differ from traditional corporate learning approaches?
Yeah, so if learning content is created in a corporation, it's usually done by instructional designers who work in the L&D department. So most courses are business related, so they don't have that knowledge. And so they need to interview supplementary experts to get that knowledge. And they have to go back and forth, check, double check, make sure that conflicts in the information are solved. And that takes a lot of time and it's very expensive. But even more importantly, once the course is finally created, it's also the instructor designer who is responsible for maintenance of that course. And that is a big problem because they are not connected to the business. They don't know when something changed. And that means that most of the time courses are outdated or get outdated really fast. And that is a big problem because what we found is that we create a lot of learning content, but in fact, what we're doing is spend a lot of time and money teaching people outdated stuff. And that is the initial problem we want to solve. The solution is pretty simple because it's just making the experts responsible for creating that content. Instead of transferring that information to the instruction designer, it also needs to be the people in the business, and the role of an instruction designer is much more supportive. And because they are creating the content, we call it employee-generated learning, EGL for short, employee-generated learning. The essence is really simple. People in the business create learning content. The company I work for, EasyGenerator, what we did, we have that whole method that we support customers with, but we also have software that people can use. And it's interesting if you put that in a bit of a bigger perspective, because initially, corporate learning, if you go back to the medieval guilds, you had a master and apprentice model where if you were new in a certain role, you would work for a master. And in that apprentice role, you would learn from that master how to do that job. So you got all your skills from that. When the Industrial Revolution started, it got incorporated into all kinds of institutions. So it got institutionalized. And we moved away from that master apprentice model and it became more formal learning, classroom training at first. There were all kinds of academies, first face-to-face academies. Later on in the 90s, it became more like online academies, but it is all formal learning. Moving back to a more bottom-up approach. So instead of the L&D department who's responsible for the creation of learning, that formal approach, we facilitate employees to create learning content themselves. So they started creating those courses in collaboration with the instructor designers. But what we also see more and more is that in addition to the learning content that they create, they start creating more performance support content. So really practical information. So we think that in the future, those creating that content could take up a role as a mentor. And with that, you will sort of move back to the traditional master apprentice system where you don't only share your knowledge in writing or in an e-learning course, but by being a mentor, you can bring a lot extra to the table. And then that completes that whole circle if you look at it from a historical perspective.
Now, in your book, you discuss the shift from top-down to bottom-up learning. How does understanding the why behind learning content, as mentioned in the conditions of learning, play into this shift? In other words, how does employee-generated learning help associates understand the importance of what they're learning?
I would actually phrase it a bit different because the point is the moment that somebody doesn't understand the why behind learning, you have a problem. Somebody tells you, you have to learn this. It's not like an internal learning need. It's something somebody tells you to. In practice, that can be the case, but only in a very few instances. I can imagine if you are talking about compliance training, security training, maybe if you talk about the vision and mission of the company, you need to be certified. We need to prove that you are complying with these things. That kind of content we will push to you. In that case, you need to explain the why, but then the why is very simple. Our customers tell us that kind of learning content is a small portion of the total learning content, maybe less than 5%. The vast majority of the content, 95%, is the content that people need to do their job. That means the initiative comes from myself. And I think that is really crucial if you talk about that top-down, bottom-up. At the moment that the learning comes bottom up, which means the learning is initiated by the worker, they are motivated, so you don't have that issue.
Now, you also touch on social learning theories in the context of situated workplace learning. How do you see the importance of associates using their own experiences as a basis for learning fitting into these theories?
Yeah, so there's a whole range of them. If you look at the social learning theories, the more theoretical things prove that that kind of learning is the best way of learning, like the 70-20-10 approach that says 10% is formal learning. So everything you learn from kindergarten to university, but also all face-to-face training that you get, e-learning course, all of that is formal learning. It adds up to maybe 10% of what you need to know to be a sufficient and efficient worker. So 20% you learn from your peers by collaborating with people, learning from them. And 70% you learn by doing. So that is a very simple model that already indicates that it is the experience that is more important as a foundation for learning than anything else. You also have what I think is a really cool theory, the 5 moments of learning need. So you have a learning phase. If you're new to something, then it's fine to go into training mode, go to a classroom session and take in all that extra information. But if you are working, that is not relevant. If you have a problem, you don't want to stop working and go into a classroom or a learning management system. You just want to find the answer, implement it, and continue with your work. So that is a really different mindset.
Great. And I think that leads us into the next question, which is, it's also important for associates to practice what they've learned. I'm just curious, how does EGL, especially in large enterprises, ensure that employees get ample opportunities to practice and overlearn?
Yeah, EGL is really about how you create content, or more precisely, who creates the content. If you look at the future of learning, learning management systems and learning experience platforms are getting outdated, or they are already outdated. What you need is that information at your fingertips, and we get the technology more and more to make that possible. And the knowledge part becomes less important because you can find that knowledge within seconds if you need it. What is really important is you have the skills. And for the skills, you need to be training on the job. You need to be practicing. You don't get to be a great salesperson by reading a book or by taking a course. It might be a foundation that you need. You can do role plays to be practicing, but to be a great salesperson, you have to do sales like 1,000 times. You have to do it in practice, fail a lot, learn from your failure, and get better and better, and also understand all the small details that are part of that. I think practice is even more important in learning. People who are just doing practice without any education will probably get further along than people who do just learning and no practice.
Interesting. Maybe I'll push back on that just a bit. So one of my undergrad degrees is in music, and I remember one of my professors would often challenge the saying that practice makes perfect. They'd say, practice makes permanent. And the idea was that if you practice something in the wrong way, you're just reinforcing it. So I can imagine those sales associates practicing over and over without any formal tools or education associated with it, that they might end up just reinforcing some bad sales habits that hinder their progress.
No, I agree with that. And that's also when you're becoming a new salesperson, then a formal training with the rules and the models you have to use will be taught. But to be actually competent in them, you need to practice them. But it also connects to the fact that you can't become an accomplished worker without proper guidance. So you do need a mentor that helps you out. Somebody who listens in on your conversations and gives you tips and tricks and tells you, wait a minute, you're doing this, but you shouldn't do that. You need to have 3 things. You need to have the theoretical foundation. You need to have to practice just by trying it out and failing. But you also need a coach that tells you where you're failing and how you can improve on that. Or maybe tells you you can do that in a better way. So I think you need all 3 of those elements to become a competent worker.
So, and I think that leads us directly into our next question, which is about feedback. And how does the EGL model facilitate feedback, especially in a democratized learning environment? Are there specific tools or strategies that you recommend to ensure constructive feedback in an EGL setting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it already starts with the creation of the content, because creating learning content is not something that's done by one person. It's a group's effort. So very often people, experts on a certain topic, work together creating a course. Once you create something, you have to have feedback on what you created. So you ask your peers if it's correct and if you can improve it. Then if you talk about the feedback for the learner themselves, it is things like your coworkers that work with you, but also somebody like a mentor. We also are able to use data for that. We used to have a way to track and trace learning results, which was called SCORM, which is really old school, outdated, but we have a new system called XAPI. And it's an open way to track and trace learning results. They extend for experience. It's not the goal of XAPI to see if you actually succeeded your course and you passed. You can do that, but it can do way more. It can actually track and trace what and how you're learning. So you can get a result database called the Learning Record Store. And a lot of companies are now uploading that information and combining it with performance information. So how are you doing on the job? Just productivity information, success rate, stuff like that. And then you can start comparing your learning effort with your performance. And then you can get feedback on how you're performing, but you also can get feedback on how the learning is impacting your performance. It's not only the people, but also the technology that will help there.
Now, I want to discuss two potential pitfalls. The first is the quality of the teaching. So I've attended several employee-generated learning sessions, and if any of my colleagues are listening, I'm not talking about yours. Sometimes, even if the content is solid, the person delivering it hasn't been trained in any teaching methods. And they're only doing this occasionally, so their presentation skills might not be up to par, which can really hold back the learning process. Can you share your thoughts on this pitfall and how you address it?
Correct. Yeah. So I think it's the most common objection whenever we talk to a learning manager. So what if the quality is really bad? And then indeed, it's not about the quality of the content, as you mentioned, because the SMEs are specialists and you can have reviews. So you can sort of check that. So it's indeed the didactical quality of the learning content. And there are a couple of things to be said there. So first, we, for example, at EasyGenerator, we have a support tool built into the tool. So you can ask questions on how to do stuff. We are step by step building that capability into the software. Because if you think about it, even how complex maybe didactics and instruction design might be, it is way simpler than having the complete business knowledge. So it's easier to build a tool with instruction design knowledge that actually helps an SME shape and form his content than it's the other way around to teach an instruction designer how the business works. For example, we have something we call the learning objective maker. So it's based on Bloom's taxonomy, although the author will not even know that. But we ask a number of questions to the author before they start, and then we help them generate a course outline. We ask the author, so give us examples or come up with examples that people actually learned. What kind of behavior will they show? Then you go from that point, what kind of content do you need to do that? So we're adding artificial intelligence to that by giving more support. So all these things you can build into software combined with AE and our view on what good learning is. You get a really fierce support environment. That is half of the equation, because the other half is what quality do you need? An example of that could be, let's say if you go back 20 or 25 years, if you look at learning, the most expensive way of creating learning would be if you would do a video, because you had to have a whole crew with cameras and a director and actors and a script and all that. It would cost like a ton of money. Right now, because we are used to YouTube, it's really effective to just use your phone and shoot a video on the job and use that for learning content. And the quality of that is, of course, way less, but it's still really effective. You might be even more effective. So the question is, what kind of quality do you need?
Great. Thank you for that. Now, another potential pitfall that comes to mind, and this goes back to what you were saying initially, that one of the downfalls of the traditional method is that you end up with a lot of outdated course content out there. Now, in my experience, I've seen that with employee-generated learning as well. And the reason is because when the learning is generated by engineers, for example, their main job, right, is generating profit from the company and getting the next project, the next product developed and so forth. And creating the course content is almost always an afterthought. And the result is that there will be decades worth of very, very old training that we still use because nobody's had time to create new updated training.
Yeah, so I think that if you are doing something like employee-generated learning and making employees responsible for sharing their knowledge, it's part of a change in the learning culture. People need to feel responsible for that, or they need to be made responsible for it. One of the examples I have, we have a hospital, pretty big, like 20,000 people working there. And the doctors and the nurses are creating a large part of the learning content. And what they found is that these courses will perform way better than the courses created by the L&D department because people trust their peers. So they see higher completion rates and they see higher success rates. But also, it is easier to create a feedback loop on that content because they know it's a peer who is writing that. If they think that you can improve or change something, it's way easier for them to reach out to that person and start discussing with them on how you can improve that. It's always clear which employee or which group of employees created the content. That is sort of a quality assurance because when their name is out there, they want to be the expert and not the failure. So they will make sure that the content is really good, but also makes it easier to create that feedback loop. If something is outdated or incorrect, it will be corrected really soon.
So let me just summarize what I'm hearing about the pitfalls. And the word that I would use to describe what you're saying is intentional. So if the employee-generated learning is just left up to the organic process of people sharing knowledge within the organization, then you're going to end up with all these problems of varying quality and outdated courses and training material. But if the L&D department and the company culture is designed around employee-generated learning as a value of the company, then those issues can get smoothed out and go away.
Yeah, maybe I can give a very different example that comes to mind now. So I'm living in the countryside and I have a pretty big garden. So I have vegetable gardens, a greenhouse, I have fruit trees, all that. If I had that, but I didn't like to garden, then probably somebody has to tell me every now and then, wait a minute, you need to take out the weed because your gardens were growing and your vegetable is ready. But I work in my garden every day because I love to do that. Once I'm done working, I love to go outside and do stuff in my garden. So there's no need to tell me that I need to take out the weed because it's something that happens as an integral part of me being in the garden. And that's the same with working. So knowledge sharing needs to be like a second nature in the end for people. I started out as a teacher, as I said in the beginning. The reason that I only taught to adults, and the reason that I never took up teaching on high school or something like that was the fact that kids are not motivated. It's so hard to make them motivated because you have to teach them stuff that it doesn't connect to what they're thinking and they're believing. I really believe that you can only do proper learning when you have motivation to learn. So it needs to be like a sort of a second nature.
Now, you already mentioned artificial intelligence, but as you look ahead, how do you envision the future of employee-generated learning, especially with the integration of technologies like AI?
Yeah, so I think today, a lot of companies are in the midst of changing the way they create learning content. The second thing that's happening, and we see that happening with a lot of our larger customers, is they don't have the capacity to create all the learning that is requested. Often, learning requests are very specific. Can you create a course for this specific group on that specific topic? The impact of learning is so small that there is no return on investment to actually create that content. So the second use case for employee-generated learning that we see growing pretty fast is basically those small specific courses for either a specific country or a specific group of experts that L&D just can't create. We have customers where thousands of people are creating courses. With that, you start capturing a large part of the knowledge in your company. In the generated database, all that knowledge is there. With AI, it becomes possible to make that knowledge available. There's a quote from a guy, he used to be the CEO of HP. His name is Louis Platt. And he said, if HP knew what HP knows, we would be 3 times more productive. And if you think about that, that is so true and so powerful because if somebody in your company has a question, probably somebody else has the answer to that question. Problem is that information is stored in the brains of those people. So what we want to do is expand that database with all that learning content and all that performance support content into what we call a corporate brain. You can do it by uploading documents, and AI can play a huge role in that. So if you would have a corporate brain, it serves a couple of functions. The first function it has is knowledge retention, which is a problem by itself. A lot of people are not working for a long time for a company. More and more people are leaving. And the second function, I think that is what's happening now. If you use ChatGPT, you have experienced that yourself. The difference between, let's say, an old school search engine in ChatGPT is pretty big. Because with search engine, you just type in a question, you get a link, you go to a website, you have to read it through to find your answer. With ChatGPT, it's different because you type in a question and you get the answer. And what I think is that in learning will happen the same. So if you look at learning management systems or even learning experience platforms, they work like Google. So you type in a question or you have to do something. You are going into a course or a smaller piece of learning content. You have to go through that, find your answer, and then see what it is. With an AI prompt interface on that corporate brain, you just type in your question, your problem, and you get your answer or your solution, and you can continue with your work. So I think that is changing learning because we do not have to teach knowledge anymore. We need to be able to find the knowledge and apply it. Learning goes much more from transferring knowledge to getting the skills you need to apply that knowledge. That is a really big change.
Great. Well, this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining us. Before we sign off, can you tell our listeners how they can find you and your work?
Yeah, so they can, of course, read the book, Employee-Generated Learning. It's published by Coben Page. I also speak on a lot of conferences and things like that. But you can also go to our corporate website, EasyGenerator.com, where we have a lot of articles and information on these white papers with more explanation on the employee-generated learning approach.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Travis.
Thank you. So what do you think? Does employee-generated learning hit all the 4 additional conditions for learning that we talked about? Personally, I think it does very well. You've got an emphasis on the why. Why is this content or topic important? People inherently use their own experiences as a basis for learning in EGL. Practice is facilitated because the learning happens so much closer to the actual work being done. And lastly, there's a focus on feedback, both for the learner and the instruction designer. This week, take some time to review the values you have in your organization or team. Is learning, especially knowledge sharing among employees, an integral, valued, even mandatory part of the culture? With that, thank you for joining me on another episode of the Management Theory Toolbox. Stay tuned until next time, where we discuss training, productivity, and technology. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep adding to your management toolbox.